The patch notes for the Dawn of the Hunt update have finally arrived, and they're missing the most important information, the numbers on skill balance. They're also missing the new support gems, which we already knew about, but essentially what this means is that right now for starting builds, we have no idea what skills are going to be good. But what we do know is that there are a bunch of very big changes confirmed that will shift the meta drastically. And in this video, I'll be discussing 3 of the biggest buffs and 3 of the biggest nerfs for Path of Exile 2's Dawn of the Hunt patch. Beginning with the nerfs. Grim Feast is no more. It's gone. It's as simple as that. No nerfing the numbers, no reworking the skill. Grim Feast was literally that problematic in terms of completely destroying their philosophy of energy shield recovery being something that you need to solve. This will mean that energy shield based builds will now need to invest into recovery through means such as boosting energy shield recharge rate and making recharge begin faster, because baseline recharge in PoE 2 is quite weak, only starting after 4 seconds of not taking any damage to energy shield and recovering a base of 12.5% of energy shield per second. Meanwhile, Ghost Dance is still alive, so energy shield evasion builds will still have great synergy in that regard, and energy shield in terms of how much of this resource you'll be able to obtain on the passive skill tree appears to be unchanged, so energy shield overall is still going to be very good. You'll just need to invest a reasonable amount to solve recovery this go around. Next up in the biggest nerfs is mana stacking, Archmage and Stormweaver. These are all lumped together here because whilst the Archmage nerf in a vacuum is about 70% less extra damage on the average mana stacking endgame build, which is around about what was expected I think, the actual extent of nerfs to those builds is far greater than that. And this is because of a combination of nerfs compiling together. For example, Archmage now causes a higher mana cost, while Eldritch Battery now doubles mana cost, which is absolutely insane. You need so much more mana recovery now on these builds to make up for those mana cost increases. Meanwhile, the amount of mana scaling available on the passive tree has been cut down massively. There was a total of 24% increased maximum mana on the passive tree, and after this update this will be dropped to just 15%. And then of course you have the Stormweaver specific nerfs. You'll have less mana overall as a result of the aforementioned changes, and this Ascendancy now gains 1% increased Arcane Surge effects per 25 maximum mana instead of per 15. So that's a huge amount of Arcane Surge scaling gone from the Stormweaver. On top of that, the extra exposure from Scouring Winds has been lowered from 20% to just 12%, and the Double Shock node now has 25% less shock magnitude as a downside on the notable, making it much harder to inflict powerful shocks. If that wasn't enough, the maximum mana small nodes on this Ascendancy are gone, replaced with mana regeneration rate instead. These changes alone are a huge nerf to mana stacking as a base archetype, but in terms of actual builds, Spark itself was also massively nerfed, firing half as many projectiles overall, including the quality change. And the third biggest nerf in Dawn of the Hunt, attribute stacking. Firstly, Hand of Wisdom and Action was nerfed by about 60% overall, with the added damage portion of these gloves now requiring twice as much intelligence, while the attack speed took a larger hit, going from 3% per 25 dexterity to 1% per 20. Meanwhile, Pillar of the Caged God scaling is being nerfed by about 50%, and add to this the massive nerf to Ingenuity, meaning a lot less attributes can be obtained from the ring slots. And gear scaling for attribute stacking overall took a large but necessary hit. But gear isn't the only thing changing for this archetype. The passive tree was a huge source of increased attributes, and these nodes didn't escape the nerfs. Spaghettification no longer provides 7% increased attributes, instead granting plus 13 to all attributes, while Polymath is going from 10% increased attributes to 7%. There's also the attack speed scaling from Falcon Technique, which took a hit too. And then of course, there's the Gemling Legionnaire, a major problem in terms of balance for attribute stacking. Well, Gemling didn't get away either. Enhanced Effectiveness, the notable which provides double inherent bonuses from attributes, now has the added downside of 20% less attributes, so while you'll be gaining more of those inherent bonuses from attributes than the other classes, you'll now likely have less total attributes overall, meaning less scaling from the attribute stacking items or the passive tree notables. Now, the patch notes for Dawn of the Hunt were a total bloodbath, packed to the brim with nerfs, but there are a few jewels in the rough. Let's get to the biggest buffs. Now, one thing to mention here is that once again, we lack the most crucial information, the actual skill numbers. Many of the biggest buffs will be hidden in those changes, but we can only go on what we have right now. So we're beginning the buffs with Crossbows. Now, Crossbows were a notable complaint from many in the early part of Path of Exile 2's launch. Aside from a few overperformers such as Gas Grenade, the skills felt incredibly undertuned overall. But in Dawn of the Hunt, Crossbows are going to have their base damage ranges increased across the board. We don't know by how much, but this is surely a step in the right direction. On top of that, the added damage modifiers on Crossbows will now use two-handed versions of these modifiers, the same ones that are used on two-handed maces or quarterstaves, for example. I have no idea why that wasn't the case before, but this is another huge change to boost the potential damage of Crossbows. There's also a very important bug fix in these patch notes. Fixed a bug where crossbow reload speed was not being affected by local attack speed modifiers on the crossbow itself. So even though the lowered reload speed was displayed on the crossbow as a result of the attack speed modifier, the actual change wasn't going through. So this is another giant buff. The fact that this wasn't working is crazy and surely went a long way to making crossbows feel a lot worse to play than they should have been. Now, on top of these changes, we also have the undisclosed skill changes. Whilst there are many changes to crossbow skills in the patch notes, these changes are meaningless without the context of damage scaling numbers. However, we do know that crossbows were in their agenda for buffs from the recent discussions in interviews, so expect numerical buffs to crossbow skills coming this patch. Buff number 2 is Warrior Ascendancies. Both the Titan and the Warbringer are receiving big changes this patch. Firstly, Titan is keeping hulking form, and it's not being changed at all, so that in its own right is incredible. But Titan is also receiving huge buffs to all of its offensive options, with surprising strengths, more damage multiplier versus heavy stunned enemies boosting up from 40% to 50%, and Prime for Stun got buffed too, so the prerequisite node is better as well. While the other branch has had its chance to proc Aftershocks buffed from 20% to 25%, there's also another change to ancestrally boosted slams in the patch notes, with the more damage component going from 20% to 30% more, and this is the effect that's granted by the Ancestral Empowerment node on the Titan, so that's another buff to Mace Titans. Now, just like the crossbow skills, we don't have the Mace skill numerical changes, but I expect many of these will have significant buffs as well. Meanwhile, for Warbringer, which was arguably one of the weakest Ascendancies, this one is also getting some much needed love. The biggest buff on this Ascendancy is likely Turtle Charm, which is now 25% less block chance instead of 35%, so you need to invest less into block to cap out your block chance for all incoming hits. There's also the change to Jade Heritage. It seems that this skill will no longer encase you in Jade, instead providing a guard buff on use, which is a massive improvement. This skill is already somewhat decent purely for the Jade stacks, which grant up to 10% additional PDR, but depending on the guard scaling, this can be extremely good defensively. There's also the significant buffs to Warbringer's minions on the Totem branch, which now grant much stronger buffs and have a strange attribute stacking angle, which may or may not be something. And for the Armor Break branch, fully broken armor now provides 20% increased physical damage taken, which is a very significant change. But with all of that said, the Warbringer does have to compete defensively with the new Smith of Kitaba, which is a tall ask. And the third and biggest buff of this patch is monsters. Yes, it's not April 1st anymore, this is not a joke. Monsters received the biggest buff in this patch, and I'm not talking about bosses or pinnacle bosses, even though these changes are affecting them. I'm talking about the average monsters you'll encounter in the campaign and in maps. Firstly, monsters will now stun you more often if you haven't been stunned recently, and this will be much more noticeable in the endgame. They'll also inflict ailments on you more commonly too, as player ailment threshold is being halved baseline, now using 50% of maximum life by default. Monsters will also be significantly harder to freeze, pin, or electrocute in the upcoming patch, so controlling them will be more difficult. And there's also new enhanced rare monster modifiers which will exist to make them more difficult and more rewarding. And they're getting smarter. But there's more. Player presence radius has been lowered, so many skills or effects will require being closer to monsters in general. while active blocking has taken quite a big hit, with the downside of being staggered, or what's now known as player heavy stun, has been increased in duration from 1 second to a ridiculous 3 seconds, which is pretty much a guaranteed death sentence. And if all of that wasn't enough, there was apparently a bug where movement skills weren't applying their slows to players properly if you had high enough attack or cast speed. So some skills are going to be slower as a result, meaning monsters will conversely catch up to you faster. Now overall, I believe that most players expected significant nerfs in this patch, and that's exactly what we're getting. To be fair, the game was very much out of control. But we really don't have the full story at the moment. In fact, most of the story is missing because of those skill numbers and support gems being a complete unknown right now, which is going to make build planning incredibly difficult as a result. Data miners, please save us. What are your thoughts on the Dawn of the Hunt patch notes? Let me know by commenting below, and thank you for watching this video. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.